Welcome back to Sip and Talk. So glad you can join us again.
Hey, everyone. Great to be here, ready to jump into another topic.
Absolutely. You know how we do it? Grab your coffee or maybe something else depending on the day. And we dive into some of these really big, sometimes pretty tricky issues floating around out there.
Yep. And today we're tackling one that, well, it gets a lot of airtime globally. It's a whole Taiwan-China relationship. And specifically, this idea you sometimes hear kicked around.
Right.
That if Taiwan were to, unify with China, somehow life for everyone there would just magically get way better.
Yeah, it's a huge claim, isn't it? And, when we hear something that's sweeping, our little antenna definitely go up here at Sip and Talk. So we've been digging through some really fascinating stuff, recent surveys, academic analyses, trying to get a handle on where this idea even comes from, what the actual data tells us, and, what the real-world consequences might actually look like.
Exactly. Our goal, like always, is to try and give you some tools, some context to cut through all the noise and really get to the heart of what's going on.
So let's get into it. Let's unpack this whole thing. Okay, So to kick us off, let's talk about what people inside China actually think about Taiwan. You might have this picture, right? Like it's just one solid block, everyone thinking exactly the same thing.
Yeah, a monolith.
Exactly. But the reality, based on some pretty interesting recent polling, it's way more complicated and, honestly, kind of surprising in places. We're looking at a poll from late summer 2024, put together by some serious players, the Carter Center, Emory University.
That's right. And this wasn't just, some quick online click poll. It involved nearly 2,500 people. And what makes it particularly interesting, I think, is one of the main authors.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah, he has really deep connections in understanding Chinese society. Comes from what they call a red second-generation family. His dad was a high-ranking military guy. His brother was a top general. The brother apparently faced some serious charges recently. But that background gives this author a pretty unique perspective, especially on the elite and the sort of inner workings. Getting this kind of data from inside China is rare, so it's a really valuable snapshot.
Okay. Definitely adds weight. So let's unpack some numbers. How about the U.S.? Always a big topic. You hear so much about anti-American feeling, but what did this poll actually find?
Well, it found about a third, 33%, felt very disgusted with the U.S., which, okay, that's a noticeable number.
It's a solid chunk.
But nearly half, 43%, were actually neutral, just neutral. And then 22%, more than 1 in 5, actually like the U.S.
Huh.
So, when you look at it all together, it's definitely not just overwhelming negativity. It's much more mixed than you might think just reading headlines.
What really jumped out at me, though, is the education part. You'd kind of assume maybe, more education equals more pro-Western views or something.
That's a common assumption.
But the poll showed the anti-U.S. feeling was pretty much the same, like 16% among university grads and 15% among people with basic education. Basically neck and neck.
Exactly. That really pushes back on that idea that higher education just automatically makes people more, quote-unquote, open-minded or pro-Western in this context.
Yeah.
It's just that how people view other countries is shaped by something, deeper. Maybe the state media narratives they hear constantly, the education system from a young age. It seems pretty ingrained.
Makes sense. It's not just about access to info, it's how it's framed.
Totally. It's the narrative that sticks.
Okay, so now the main event, Taiwan. This is where things get really contradictory and super interesting. What about using military force for unification? That's the big one.
Yeah, and here's the surprise. A clear majority, 55.1%, said they do not agree with using military force. More than half.
Wow, okay. So most people don't actually want a war.
It seems that way. It suggests, a desire to avoid the conflict, the disruption, the human cost in their own lives. Only about a quarter, 24.5%, actually supported using force, and 20% were neutral. So, yeah, majority against force.
Okay, but here's the kicker, right? Because they asked another question.
Exactly. This is where it flips. When they were asked when they thought military action would happen, the numbers just went completely the other way.
How so?
A staggering 80%, 80, believe unification by force would happen eventually.
80%.
Yep. And get this. Of those people, over half, 53%, thought it would happen within the next 5 years.
5 years. Wow.
Yeah, with about 33.5% saying 5 years specifically, and another 20% saying within just 1 year. Only a small group, 18%, thought it would never happen.
Okay, hold on. Let me get this straight. More than half don't want war, but 80% expect it to happen anyway, and soon. That is a massive disconnect. It's like, I hate the idea of jumping off this cliff, but I'm pretty sure someone's going to push me off soon. What does that tell us?
It screams fatalism, doesn't it? A deep feeling of, well, it doesn't matter what I want, this is going to happen anyway.
Yeah.
It implies that even if people personally dread the consequences of war, the economic hit, the loss of life, they see the state's decision, the national will, as something completely separate and unstoppable.
Like their opinion just doesn't factor into the equation.
Exactly. In a system where the party line or the national objective trumps individual preferences, people feel like they have no real say, no agency, resign themselves to what they think is inevitable.
That makes a certain kind of depressing sense.
Okay, let's widen the lens a bit. What about Russia? Given everything going on, you might expect some mixed feelings there too. You might think so, especially considering, history. But the poll, very clear. A huge 80% of respondents believe Russia will respect China's interests.
80% trust Russia to respect their interests.
Yep. And only 4.5% disagreed. It's quite striking, especially when you remember, or if you know, that historically Russia and the Soviet Union took massive chunks of territory from China, like Vladivostok used to be called Haitianwei in Chinese.
Right. People might not know that history, or it's downplayed.
Exactly. This high level of trust probably comes straight from that controlled information environment, the education system pushing a specific narrative about Russia being this key strategic partner against the West, current politics over historical facts.
Okay. And neighbors like South Korea and Japan. Always sensitive relationships. Did the poll touch on how people felt about potential actions from them?
It did. For instance, if South Korea were to develop nuclear weapons, what should China do? Well, about 26% supported military intervention.
Military intervention.
Yeah. Another 20% wanted diplomatic protests, 18% economic sanctions. So a pretty strong reaction leaning towards aggressive options for a significant minority.
And Japan. If they changed their post-war constitution regarding military action, that's always a hot button.
Even more so. If Japan were to amend its constitution to allow offensive military capabilities, 36% over a third supported military intervention.
Higher than for South Korea.
Yep. Another 30% favored diplomatic moves. Only about 3.5% thought China should do nothing. So very little tolerance for Japan changing its military posture.
This really brings us to that idea you mentioned earlier, this selective nationalism or double standards.
It really highlights it, doesn't it? It's like, the feeling is South Korea shouldn't get nukes, but hey, North Korea having them. That's okay.
All right.
Japan shouldn't change its peace constitution, but Russia invading Ukraine, well, that's different. It's a clear two-track way of judging things.
Cultivated by state media, you're saying?
Absolutely. Years of it. Countries labeled friendly, like North Korea, Russia, they get a pass. Countries labeled enemies or rivals, the U.S., Japan, South Korea, Taiwan, face much harsher judgment. It's not about international law or objective morality. It's about who fits the state's current narrative.
And here's where it gets kind of scary, right? For you, listening, think about this. If this kind of public mood gets strong enough, it can actually start to influence the leaders.
It can create pressure.
Yeah, even if some officials want to be more careful or rational, they might feel like they have to take a tougher stance to satisfy this public feeling, this nationalism. They get sort of emotionally hijacked.
Right, and the public might cheer for actions that actually end up being harmful in the long run because they're caught up in that narrative.
And they lose the ability to really question their leaders. It becomes this dangerous feedback loop, potentially escalating things. Someone mentioned parallels to 1936 Japan.
Yep.
That's a chilling comparison.
It is. Some of the rhetoric you see online today echoes of that Greater East Asia co-prosperity sphere idea. It's definitely something to be aware of, that historical context.
Okay, shifting gears slightly. You might have caught wind of this story. There's a Taiwanese influencer, the Zhong, talking about meeting groups in the U.S.
Right, claiming to represent people in Shanghai who want independence.
Exactly. Like Shanghai breaking away from Beijing, similar to Taiwan's situation. And it sounds dramatic, right? A major Chinese city wanting out.
It does sound like a big deal. But this is where we really need to, pump the brakes and look closely.
Apply some critical thinking.
Definitely. This is a perfect example of needing to check the actual scale and the local impact. Because while the idea of Shanghai independence exists, based on everything we understand, it's an extremely fringe thing.
Like really on the edges.
Really on the edges. It's not some big growing movement inside Shanghai. Not at all.
So who are these groups then, like the one the influencer met?
Well, there's one called the Shanghai National Party, founded in 2018. But here's the thing.
What's the catch?
They're based in New York.
Ah, Not Shanghai.
Not Shanghai. Miles away. And while they talk about independence, best estimates put their membership at maybe, a few dozen, maybe a couple hundred tops. That's hardly a groundswell movement in Shanghai.
Right. That's like me starting a California secedes movement from, I don't know, London. It doesn't mean anything's actually happening back home.
Precisely. And other mentions you might see, like Hudu or the Shanghai Autonomy Movement, they're mostly online discussions, maybe some academic debates, or focused on preserving Shanghai's unique culture and dialect. They aren't really active political movements pushing for a split.
Okay, let's put it in perspective. Shanghai's huge, right? Like 22 million people.
Roughly, yeah. Massive city.
So if we're talking a few hundred supporters, maybe optimistically 1,000, what tiny fraction of the population is that?
It's minuscule, like 0.00005%, maybe less. It's basically statistically zero in the grand scheme of things. It hasn't entered mainstream discussion at all in Shanghai. Most people there probably never even heard of these groups.
So why is it so small? Why hasn't it caught on locally if the idea exists overseas?
Well, the biggest reason is pretty straightforward. The Chinese government keeps an incredibly tight lid on any kind of political dissent, especially anything that smells like separatism.
They'd shut it down fast.
Instantly. Any hint of organizing something like this in Shanghai would be suppressed very quickly and very harshly. Plus, while you have to take official surveys with a grain of salt because people might be afraid to speak freely.
Right, self-censorship.
Exactly.
Yeah.
But even surveys, like one from Harvard back in 2020, showed really high levels of reported satisfaction with the central government, like 95%. Again, interpret carefully, but it does reflect how hard it would be and how risky to start any kind of independence movement locally. The control is just too pervasive.
Okay, so the key thing for you listening is don't get swept up by dramatic headlines. While the idea of Shanghai independence might be floating around among some overseas groups, the reality inside Shanghai is that support is virtually non-existent.
Right. It's absolutely nothing like the situation in Taiwan, with its completely different history, political system, and widespread sense of distinct identity. Always check the scale and the source.
All right, let's get to the absolute core of what we're talking about today. This claim, this narrative, unification with China will make life better for Taiwan.
You hear it repeated often enough.
You do, but when you actually start to pick it apart, look at the logic behind it. Well, it starts to look pretty shaky. There are some really big holes in the argument.
It's one of those things that sounds good on the surface, right? Like an offer of help. Join us. Things will be better. But it's built on, frankly, a lot of questionable assumptions, and it just ignores inconvenient facts.
So what's the usual logic? Like, China's economy is huge, life's improving there, Taiwan's maybe stuck somehow, so just join up and get rich?
That's basically the gist of it, yeah. But it's a classic logical fallacy. It's confusing correlation with causation. It's making a false comparison between two very different places. It assumes you can just copy-paste one system onto another and expect the same results. It doesn't work like that.
Okay, let's break down these fallacies. Fallacy number 1.
Fallacy, #1. Confusing economy with happiness. The single metric myth. Basically thinking that a bigger GDP automatically equals a better life for everyone.
Right. Money isn't everything.
Exactly. Economic growth is important, sure.
Yeah.
But it's not the only thing that matters for quality of life or just, being happy. China's GDP might be growing fast, but they also have huge wealth inequality. Their Gini coefficient, that measure of inequality, is around 0.5. That's a really big gap between the rich and poor.
Yeah, it's like saying the average temperature in country is comfortable, but that ignores the fact that some people are freezing and others are boiling. You've got look beyond the average. You've got that crazy high youth unemployment, over 20%, sometimes so high they start reporting it. You've got tight controls on what people can say, forced evictions happening, people being made to do public self-criticisms. That stuff massively impacts your daily life, no matter how big the national GDP is.
Precisely. And then you look at Taiwan. Maybe its total GDP isn't as enormous, but it offers things China doesn't. A stable legal system you can rely on, much more personal freedom, a strong sense of security day to day. You can have a booming economy on paper and still have major social problems that make life tough.
Okay, fallacy number 2. This one seems kind of obvious. Ignoring the elephant in the room. Hello, Hong Kong.
Right. If unification is the magic key to a better life, why isn't Hong Kong the poster child for this?
Exactly. They returned in 97 under one country, two systems. It was supposed to be the model.
It was. For decades, that was the line. But especially since 2020 with the national security law, what have we seen? Freedom's just dismantled.
Free speech, free press, gone.
Independent newspapers shut down, like Apple Daily, Stand News, and a huge brain drain, tons of young people, professionals, just leaving because they don't see a future there anymore.
So the promise was better life, but the reality in Hong Kong looks like the opposite for many people. It's a living, breathing counter-argument to the whole claim. Life demonstrably did not get better for many in terms of freedom and autonomy after integration.
It's a very stark example of promises not matching reality. It shows political integration under Beijing's system can mean losing the very things that made a place unique and successful. A serious warning sign.
Okay, fallacy number 3. Disregarding Taiwan's existing prosperity, like pretending Taiwan is some struggling backwater that needs rescuing.
Yeah, the argument often implies Taiwan is somehow failing or stuck. But look at the numbers. Taiwan's GDP per capita, it's estimated around $32,000 to $36,000 US dollars for 2024.
Okay, and China's?
China's is around $12,000.
Whoa. So Taiwan's average income is like 3 times higher?
Roughly, yeah.
Yeah.
A huge difference in living standards. And it's not just money.
Right. Taiwan has that amazing universal healthcare system everyone talks about. Real courts that are independent. A press that can actually criticize the government. Plus, a Taiwanese passport gets you into over 140 countries without a visa. A Chinese passport, around 70. That's real freedom of movement. Taiwan isn't struggling. It's doing really well by most global standards.
The fallacy is acting like Taiwan is desperate, when it's actually already a prosperous, free, secure society with strong international links. It dismisses their own success.
Okay, this next one, fallacy number 4, this one kind of gets under my skin. Ignoring what Taiwanese people actually want. It's like the arrogance of it.
It really is. The whole "will make your life better" pitch completely ignores the most basic question. Do the people of Taiwan even want this supposed better life if it comes at the cost of everything they've built?
Yeah. It's this attitude of, we know what's best for you, even if you say you want something else.
Exactly. It's pure logical arrogance. Sometimes there's even this condescending undertone like, oh, you poor things don't understand what true happiness or stability is. Dictating happiness for 23 million people, it's deeply problematic. It denies their right to choose their own future.
Okay, final one. Fallacy number 5. Control disguised as help. If it's not really about making life better in terms of freedom or even maybe economics, what's really behind this unification is good for you line?
What it really means is, Taiwan, you need to give up your sovereignty, your political system, your distinct identity, and in return, you get economic integration. But it's an integration where Beijing calls all the shots.
It's not a partnership.
Not at all.
Not at all.
It's absorption.
Sure.
Think about other regions within China, Xinjiang, Tibet, Inner Mongolia. Are the people there, the Uyghurs, the Tibetans, feeling like their lives got undeniably better in terms of freedom, human rights, preserving their culture after being fully integrated? The evidence suggests not so much. Often it means intense control and suppression.
So it's not really help. It's takeover, dressed up in nice language, like a benevolent dictator saying, I'll take care of everything, just give me total control. It requires Taiwan to erase itself.
Pretty much. So to wrap up this part, the argument that unification will improve Taiwan's quality of life just doesn't hold water when you examine it closely. It's based on flawed logic, ignores inconvenient facts like Hong Kong, dismisses Taiwan's own success and the will of its people, and ultimately seems more about control than genuine help.
Okay, so if the better life promise is built on shaky ground, let's flip the coin. What does the evidence, the research, the expert analysis actually suggest would happen to Taiwan if unification occurred, especially on Beijing's terms?
Yeah, and this is where we look at studies from places like Freedom House, CSIS, Brookings, respected institutions analyzing these scenarios. Plus, again, the hard lessons from Hong Kong.
And the picture they paint is not rosy.
Not at all. The overwhelming consensus is that unification under the current circumstances would likely lead to a significant deterioration of life in Taiwan across the board, politically, economically, socially, culturally. It's a pretty stark warning.
Okay, let's break that down. Area 1, political freedom. That seems like the most immediate and obvious change.
Absolutely. Taiwan is consistently ranked as one of Asia's strongest democracies. Freedom House gives it a score of 94 out of 100 for freedom in 2024. That's free.
And China?
China gets a 9 out of 100. Authoritarian. So unification means Taiwan gets absorbed into that system.
And what does that mean practically for someone living there?
It means the things you take for granted disappear. Free press, gone. Independent courts, compromised. Multiple parties competing in real elections, over. The right to vote freely, hold referendums, finished. Instead, you get censorship, Security forces everywhere, the great firewall blocking the internet.
A total clampdown.
A total clampdown. Political scientists like Manfield and Snyder have studied this. Forcing vastly different political systems together almost always leads to democratic collapse, major instability.
It's a known pattern.
Okay, but what about the economy? The argument for unification often centers on economic benefits. Why would it actually get worse?
Because unification, even if Beijing calls it peaceful, would likely be seen internationally by the US, Japan, Europe, as a forced annexation, a violation of the status quo.
Exactly. And the analyses suggest these major powers would almost certainly react with significant economic sanctions against China, and by extension, the newly incorporated Taiwan. Or they just pull their investments out.
So foreign companies would flee?
Very likely. Think about it. Companies invested in Taiwan partly because it's stable, democratic, follows international rules. If it suddenly becomes part of China, subject to Beijing's opaque rules, political interference, intellectual property risks, many would lose confidence.
Especially tech companies like TSMC.
Huge implications for them. TSMC, MediaTek. These global giants might be pressured internationally to move key operations, or they might do it themselves to protect their business. International ratings agencies would downgrade Taiwan, making borrowing harder. Capital would just pour out.
And the impact on ordinary people.
Devastating. CSIS estimated back in 2023 that Taiwan's GDP could drop by over 20% in the short term. That means mass unemployment, business failures, falling wages, an economic catastrophe, not a boom.
Wow. Okay, beyond politics and economics. What about just society, the way people interact, trust each other?
Unification means adopting China's governance model, including things like the social credit system, pervasive surveillance. We saw a preview in Hong Kong.
Right, you mentioned trust plummeted there.
Dramatically, the civic trust index dropped from 70 to 38. People became suspicious of each other, afraid to speak openly, and that massive exodus, over 100,000 people leaving, that tears the social fabric apart.
It creates this climate of fear and anxiety.
Exactly. Psychologists call it learned helplessness. When people feel powerless against an overwhelming force, it leads to division, anxiety, depression. It breaks the community spirit.
And Taiwan's unique culture, its identity.
That would be under direct threat. We know Taiwanese identity is strong. That poll showing 65.5% identify only as Taiwanese and only 2.4% want unification.
So Beijing would try to erase that.
History suggests yes. They push what's called delocalization and re-Sinicization.
What does that mean day to day?
It means things like maybe banning the term Taiwan Nation, forcing name changes on institutions like National Taiwan University, rewriting history textbooks to fit Beijing's narrative, downplaying Taiwan's own story, marginalizing local languages like Minnan or Hakka or indigenous cultures in schools and media.
Trying to make everyone just Chinese.
Essentially. It's cultural colonization, and it breeds deep resentment and resistance.
Finally, just basic personal safety, being able to live without fear.
Under laws like China's national security law or the anti-secession law, just thinking the wrong thing or saying something critical can land you in serious trouble. Prison sentences of 10 years or more aren't uncommon for dissent.
We saw that in Hong Kong too, right? Journalists arrested, books banned.
Yep. Journalists, YouTubers arrested for criticizing the government, books pulled from library shelves, academics blacklisted, activists disappearing or forced into exile. It means losing the basic freedom to speak your mind, access information, or even disagree without fearing the knock on the door.
That's terrifying. Just the loss of basic security.
So yeah, putting it all together, the research and the real-world examples strongly point toward unification, leading to a sharp decline in life for people in Taiwan, politically, economically, socially, culturally, and in terms of personal safety.
So when you lay out all those potential downsides, it really boils down to something more fundamental than just politics or economics, doesn't it? It's about values, about the entire system people live under.
Absolutely. The core question isn't really, can unification help Taiwan in some abstract way? It's why on earth would Taiwan choose to give up the system? It already has a system that works pretty well for its people, for something so uncertain and, frankly, likely much worse in many crucial ways.
What does Taiwan offer its people right now that China simply doesn't or can't under its current system?
Well, fundamentally, Taiwan is a free democracy. People choose their leaders, hold them accountable. There's rule of law. There's that amazing universal healthcare system we mentioned. Affordable, accessible, quality care for everyone.
Huge peace of mind.
Huge. Plus, robust international connections, freedom to travel, access information globally. Compare that to China's one-party rule, the state control over so much of life, the closed information environment.
It's not just different ways of governing, it's a different philosophy about the individual versus the state. A whole different lived reality.
Exactly. Taiwan represents a system where people feel they have agency, they have rights, they have self-determination. They've built this identity over decades of democratic struggle and success. There's this core value, you hear it a lot, that they don't need saving by anyone.
They can manage their own affairs?
Right, they have subjectivity. They choose their own path, elect their own leaders, enjoy freedoms that are just non-existent in mainland China. It's about dignity, about choosing your own life.
And that just demolishes that initial claim, unification makes life better. Because when you look closely, Taiwan already has many of the better things. Freedom, democracy, prosperity, a strong social safety net, self-respect.
It's a stark contrast, isn't it? A system based on individual liberty versus one based on centralized control. And for you listening, really grasping that fundamental difference in values and systems is key to understanding why this issue is so much more than just a political dispute. It's about two fundamentally different visions of how society should work and what makes life worthwhile. #tag conclusion. So where does that leave us after this pretty detailed look? We saw the contradictions in Chinese public opinion, people not wanting war but expecting it, the selective nationalism.
Right. We busted the myth about a big Shanghai independence movement. Turns out it's tiny and mostly overseas.
And we really took apart that unification makes life better argument, showing the logical flaws, the inconvenient case of Hong Kong, how it ignores Taiwan's own success, and crucially, what Taiwanese people actually want.
Yeah, exposing it as being more about control than actual help.
And then we looked at the evidence suggesting unification would likely mean a major downgrade for Taiwan, lost freedoms, economic damage, social breakdown, cultural suppression, the opposite of a better life.
So, the big takeaway. This whole situation is way more complex than the simple slogans you hear. You really need to think critically, look at the data, understand the different perspectives.
Which leads to maybe a final question for you to think about. In today's world, with so much information flying around, how do we make sure we're really looking past the headlines, understanding the nuances, and not just reacting to the loudest voices?
That is a great question to chew on. We really hope this conversation gave you some new angles, maybe challenge some assumptions.
Thanks for sipping and talking with us today.
Always a pleasure. And hey, if you enjoyed this discussion, if you like getting these kinds of insights, make sure you subscribe to Sip and Talk wherever you get your podcasts. Don't miss out.
And, you know, if you want something completely different, totally fun, check out our good friend Mickey's YouTube channel, Mickytolife. Seriously, he's got everything. Funny memes, great music, wine tasting, amazing travel stuff. It's just pure fun.
That's Mickytolife. Mickytolife, all one word. Definitely check him out. Until next time, stay curious, keep questioning, and keep sipping.